No trade is free. This video is based on key insights from the book No Trade is Free by Robert Lighthizer. Introduction. Robert Lighthizer recounts a pivotal moment in 2010, testifying before a U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission on a gloomy day in Washington, D.C. He wasn't just presenting facts and figures, he was delivering a warning. For over 30 years, Lighthizer had been a trade lawyer, witnessing firsthand what he believed were the damaging effects of trade policies that prioritized cheap goods over American jobs. He was known in Washington as someone who questioned whether these trade deals were really helping the United States. His 35-page testimony detailed how granting China, most favored nation, status in 2000 had been a mistake, a deal that sounded great on paper but led to significant job losses and stagnant wages for American workers. He pointed out that China hadn't kept many of the promises it made when joining the World Trade Organization, and politicians had been overly optimistic about the benefits. Lighthizer argues that the problem wasn't just about trade with China, but a bigger issue with how the U.S. approached trade overall. Both Democrats and Republicans, influenced by large companies, seemed focused on lowering prices for consumers and maximizing profits, even if it meant American workers suffered. He explains that while companies made more money, many American factories closed or moved overseas, and wages didn't keep up with the cost of living. He uses examples like the computer industry, where Apple once made computers in America, but now most are imported, or the solar cell industry, which America once led but now China dominates. He also points to furniture, cars, and semiconductors, all industries where America has lost ground to foreign competition. He emphasizes that the U.S. is even starting to import more food than it exports, a worrying sign for the country's economic independence. The election of Donald Trump in 2016, Lighthizer believes, was a direct result of people recognizing these failed policies. Trump asked Lighthizer to lead his trade efforts because of his long-standing criticism of these issues. Lighthizer's core belief is that trade policy should prioritize American workers. He believes that while things like corporate profits and lower prices are important, they shouldn't come at the expense of good-paying jobs and a strong manufacturing sector. He explains that people are first producers, they work to earn a living, and then consumers. A strong economy needs people who are able to make things, not just buy them. Lighthizer highlights two major accomplishments of the Trump administration. First, they changed the goal of trade policy. Instead of chasing big trade deals that encouraged companies to move production overseas, they focused on bringing jobs back to America and reducing the trade deficit. Second, they woke up the country to the threat posed by China. Lighthizer argues that China isn't a friendly partner, but an adversary that wants to challenge American leadership. He explains that before Trump, China was often portrayed as a friend, but this was a mistake. He describes China as a country that unfairly competes and wants to impose its own system on the world. He points out that under Trump, the trade deficit with China actually started to shrink, and companies began to move production out of China. The Phase 1 trade agreement with China, he says, maintained tariffs and pushed China to make important changes. Lighthizer's book aims to challenge how people think about trade. He wants to explain his philosophy and the data that supports it, and to show how a trade policy focused on American workers can actually work. He plans to delve into the history of trade, explain why the World Trade Organization has failed, and detail how the Trump administration confronted China, renegotiated NAFTA, and addressed trade issues with other countries. He believes the old consensus on free trade is over, and that both Democrats and Republicans are starting to recognize the need for a new approach. He hopes his book will provide a roadmap for a future where trade policy truly benefits American families and strengthens the nation. Chapter 1, Where It Started. Robert Lighthizer recounts his journey to becoming the United States Trade Representative under President Trump, framing it as a lifelong preparation for a battle to prioritize American workers. He anticipated the role, understanding it wouldn't be easy, involving clashes with big businesses, globalist viewpoints, and even those within his own party who favored traditional free trade. Lighthizer felt ready for this fight, having developed his trade philosophy over 35 years, based on real-world experience rather than just theories. The author's dedication to this cause stems from his upbringing in Ashtabula, Ohio, a once thriving industrial city. He vividly remembers a bustling town with a busy port, railroads, and factories supplying the auto industry. However, Lighthizer notes the decline of Ashtabula, with the loss of jobs to overseas competition, painting a picture of a community struggling with poverty and limited opportunities. This personal connection fueled his desire to create trade policies that would support working-class families like those he grew up with. Lighthizer's family history, tracing back to humble beginnings and evolving through generations of blue-collar workers and farmers, further solidified his commitment to this cause. Lighthizer explains that the prevailing belief in Washington, D.C., often overlooked the real-world consequences of free trade policies. He felt that the benefits of globalization were often emphasized, while the hardships faced by communities like Ashtabula were dismissed as theoretical or easily solvable. He observed a disconnect between the elite world of Georgetown and the struggles of everyday Americans, noting that the voices advocating for free trade often didn't fully grasp the costs to those affected. He highlights that the focus shifted to prioritizing importers over U.S. manufacturers, influenced by lobbying money and a belief in the inevitability of market forces. His early career experiences, working with Senator Robert Dole, and then as Deputy U.S. Trade Representative under President Reagan, shaped his understanding of trade negotiations. Lighthizer learned the importance of leverage, particularly the credible threat of tariffs, in achieving favorable outcomes. He recalls President Reagan's own recognition that free trade must be fair trade, citing examples of actions taken to protect American industries from unfair competition. However, he also notes that subsequent administrations, until Trump, didn't prioritize trade issues to the same degree. The author recalls Donald Trump's early criticisms of unfair trade practices, particularly with Japan and later with China, recognizing a shared perspective. He details how Trump consistently voiced concerns about trade deficits and the need to protect American jobs. Lighthizer emphasizes that Trump's focus on trade was a central reason for his presidential campaign and a defining characteristic of his presidency. He contrasts Trump's deep engagement with trade issues with previous administrations, where it was often a secondary concern. Lighthizer describes the shift in focus from Japan to China as a major turning point, noting China's growing economic power and its use of mercantilist practices like state subsidies and intellectual property theft to gain an unfair advantage. He explains that the China shock had a devastating impact on American workers and communities. He recounts his own legal work representing U.S. manufacturers fighting against unfair trade practices, highlighting the limitations of the World Trade Organization, WTO, in addressing these issues. He felt the WTO often failed to uphold U.S. laws and protect American interests. Ultimately, Lighthizer portrays President Trump as a leader who genuinely cared about trade and was committed to fulfilling his promises to American workers. He recounts a moment where President Trump acknowledged Lighthizer's expertise and praised his efforts in negotiating trade agreements. Lighthizer concludes that the long hours and challenges were worthwhile, signifying a return to prioritizing American interests in trade policy. Chapter 2, Where We Are Now. Robert Lighthizer believes that the way the United States approached trade after World War II went wrong in the 1990s. For many years, the U.S. tried to help other countries by lowering trade barriers, hoping they would then buy more American products. But Lighthizer argues this didn't work as planned. Instead, the U.S. made 3 big trade deals in a row, and after that, millions of jobs were lost, and the country started buying way more from other countries than it sold to them. He calls this a big mistake, like betting everything on one horse and losing. Lighthizer stresses the need for fair trade, meaning other countries should treat American products the same way the U.S. treats theirs. He explains that for decades, the U.S. has made trade deals that didn't help American businesses get a fair chance in other markets. He wants trade to be balanced, so the U.S. isn't constantly sending money to other countries just to buy cheaper goods. He uses the example of a family budget. You can't keep spending more than you earn without getting into trouble. The author points out that some people see trade as a way to make friends with other countries, believing that if the U.S. buys a lot from them, they'll like us more. Others think trade is just about getting the lowest prices for consumers, even if it means losing American jobs. Lighthizer disagrees with both ideas. He believes most Americans want trade policies that help their communities thrive, with good jobs, strong families, and safe neighborhoods. He argues that a country's strength comes from its workers, and trade should support them. This idea, he says, was the goal of the trade policies during the Trump administration. Lighthizer clarifies that the Trump administration didn't try to completely shut off trade with other countries, but it did try to find a better balance. They wanted to protect American jobs and make sure workers were treated with respect. He points to the USMCA agreement with the United States, Mexico, and Canada as a good example. This new agreement, he believes, was designed to benefit American workers. The author also mentions that the administration took a new approach to trade with China and the World Trade Organization, WTO, with the same goal in mind. While Lighthizer is critical of recent trade policies, he acknowledges that trade hasn't been all bad. He recognizes that the U.S. is a major exporter and that competition with other countries helps American businesses stay innovative. He also notes the importance of exports for farmers and the success of the U.S. in areas like technology and financial services. However, he cautions that the large trade surplus in services isn't as reliable as it seems, and a lot of it comes from things like foreign students and tourists, or from companies moving profits around to avoid taxes. Lighthizer explains that after the Cold War ended, the U.S. became too eager to embrace free trade, believing that democracy and free markets would spread everywhere. He argues that this led to a neglect of American interests. While free trade did benefit some big companies and consumers with lower prices, it also led to job losses and economic hardship for many communities. He compares this to a wave that was expected to lift everyone up, but ultimately crashed down. He believes the Clinton administration especially pushed for free trade deals that favored other countries and corporations over American workers. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and giving China permanent trade status were examples of this, according to Lighthizer. The author highlights the negative consequences of these policies, including the loss of millions of manufacturing jobs and a rise in what he calls deaths of despair, increases in suicide, drug overdoses, and liver disease among middle-aged workers who lost their jobs. He acknowledges that automation and other factors also played a role, but argues that sending jobs overseas had a devastating impact on many communities. He believes that the disconnect between the people making trade policy and the everyday Americans affected by it was too great. Lighthizer firmly believes that free trade, as it's often talked about, doesn't really exist. He points out that successful economies like Britain, Germany, and Japan all built their industries with protectionist policies, things like tariffs to protect their own businesses. He argues that countries become strong by making things, not just by buying them. He also challenges the idea that free trade automatically leads to peace, pointing to examples where economic ties didn't prevent conflict. He criticizes the idea that efficiency should be the only goal of trade policy. While lower prices are nice, he believes it's more important to focus on creating good jobs and strong communities. He argues that simply retraining workers for new jobs isn't a solution, as many of those jobs are low-paying or vulnerable to being sent overseas as well. He emphasizes the importance of manufacturing for innovation and economic growth. Lighthizer is particularly concerned about the long-term trade deficits the U.S. has been running for decades. He explains that these deficits mean the U.S. is selling off its assets to other countries, and that this is not sustainable. He uses the analogy of a family spending more than it earns, eventually running out of savings. He believes that China's trade practices are particularly unfair, and that the U.S. needs to take a stronger stance. He suggests tariffs could be a way to address these imbalances. Finally, Lighthizer stresses the importance of protecting American manufacturing and prioritizing the needs of American workers. He believes that trade policy should be about building a strong and prosperous future for all Americans, not just maximizing efficiency or pursuing foreign policy goals. He concludes that a common-sense approach to trade, focused on the common good, is essential for the future of the United States. Chapter 3. A Short and Selective History of U.S. Trade Policy. Robert Lighthizer begins by explaining that when the Trump administration started, they were told they were changing things in a bad way with trade. People said America had always traded a certain way, and Trump's ideas were new and risky. But Lighthizer argues the opposite is true. He believes protecting American businesses and workers has been important since the very beginning of the country, even before it was a country. He points out that the colonists fought for independence partly because Britain controlled their trade and didn't treat them fairly. Lighthizer emphasizes that the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power to make trade rules, not states or other countries. He explains that the Founding Fathers didn't want anyone telling America what to do in trade, remembering how Britain had limited what the colonies could make and sell. They wanted to be able to protect American businesses and make sure they could grow. He recalls how early leaders like Alexander Hamilton believed tariffs taxes on imported goods were important to help American companies get started and become strong. Hamilton thought America needed to make its own goods, especially things needed for defense, so it wouldn't have to rely on other countries. The author details how, for many years, the U.S. used a mix of encouraging American businesses and negotiating fair deals with other countries. He notes that even Thomas Jefferson, who generally favored farming and free trade, believed in getting fair prices for American goods and protecting them if other countries weren't playing fair. After the War of 1812, it became even clearer that America needed to make some things itself to be truly independent. Lighthizer stresses that this wasn't about shutting out trade, but about making sure American workers and businesses could compete and thrive. He highlights a consistent theme throughout American history. The federal government should control trade policy to benefit the country as a whole. Lighthizer argues that things began to go wrong in the 1990s, when the U.S. started letting other countries have more say in its trade policies. He believes this was a dangerous experiment. He connects this shift to the rise of populism and Trump's election, suggesting people felt left behind by these new trade policies. He contends that the Trump administration wasn't being radical, but simply trying to return to common-sense trade principles that had made America strong. He believes the real radicals were those pushing for completely free trade without considering the impact on American workers. The author explains that the founders intended to use America's large market as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations. They understood that simply opening the borders to all imports wasn't a good idea. They wanted to get the best possible deals for American businesses and workers. He uses Hamilton as an example, pointing out that Hamilton warned about other countries blocking American exports and argued for policies to help American manufacturers. Lighthizer emphasizes that both Hamilton and Jefferson agreed on the importance of using trade to benefit the U.S. economy. Lighthizer details how tariffs were a major source of government revenue in the early days of the country and were used to encourage manufacturing. He describes how figures like Henry Clay championed the American system, which included protective tariffs to help American businesses compete. He notes that even Abraham Lincoln believed in protecting American industries. He points out that for much of American history, there was a broad agreement that the U.S. should have control over its trade policy and use it to support its economy and national security. The author then discusses the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT) after World War II, and later the World Trade Organization, WTO. He acknowledges that these organizations aim to reduce trade barriers and promote peace, but argues that they ultimately weakened America's ability to protect its interests. He explains that the WTO system allowed other countries to challenge American trade policies and win cases against the U.S., even when those policies were designed to protect American workers. He believes the U.S. was treated unfairly within the WTO system. Lighthizer is particularly critical of the decision to give China permanent normal trade relations in 2000. He argues that this was a mistake that allowed China to become a major economic power and take advantage of the U.S. market. He claims that this decision led to the loss of many American manufacturing jobs and a growing trade deficit with China. He believes that the Obama administration, despite recognizing the problems with the WTO system, was unable to change course. He states that the focus on globalization hurt American workers and didn't deliver the promised benefits. Lighthizer concludes by stating that the Trump administration was simply trying to return to the trade policies that had made America prosperous, in the past policies that prioritized American workers and businesses, and used the leverage of the U.S. market to get fair deals. He suggests that Trump's election was a result of decades of failed trade policies and a desire to put America first. Chapter 4: How the WTO Has Failed America. Robert Lighthizer argues that the World Trade Organization, often seen as the heart of global trade rules, wasn't the beginning of fair trade. It actually came decades after a system that already worked pretty well. He explains that before the WTO, from after World War II until 1995, trade grew massively, but countries still had the freedom to protect their own businesses when needed. Disputes were settled through talks, not strict court rulings. Lighthizer believes that the U.S. and others thought the old system was messy and tried to fix it by creating the WTO, especially its powerful dispute settlement system, the appellate body. During his time as the U.S. trade representative, Lighthizer found that many people didn't even understand what the WTO did. They thought it set prices and made all the rules, but he clarifies that it only acts when all member countries agree. He compares it to a trade group where countries negotiate and a courtroom where they settle disagreements. The big change with the WTO wasn't the negotiating part, but the new courtroom meant to replace political bargaining with decisions from fair experts. However, Lighthizer contends this system ultimately failed, not just for the U.S., but for the world. Lighthizer details how the promises made about the WTO didn't match reality. The U.S. was told it would help American workers and businesses, but instead, trade deficits grew. The dispute system was supposed to open markets for U.S. goods, but the U.S. lost most of the cases brought against it and rarely won anything significant. The appellate body wasn't just supposed to correct errors. It started to create new rules, going beyond what countries had originally agreed to. The U.S. was repeatedly told its laws were breaking WTO rules, forcing Congress to change them. Even after allowing China to join the WTO, hoping it would become a responsible trading partner, Lighthizer asserts that China continued its unfair practices and actually benefited from the system. He points out that the WTO's dispute system actually stopped countries from negotiating, as they found it easier to win cases in court than to make deals. This led to unfair rules and hurt U.S. interests. Lighthizer concludes that the WTO didn't bring a golden age of trade, but a complicated mess. He explains that the U.S. was led to believe the Uruguay Round Agreement would improve trade balance and raise wages, but it didn't happen. Lighthizer highlights the issue of the U.S. trade balance plummeting after joining the WTO in 1995, with the trade deficit increasing significantly. He connects this to a stagnation in median household income, suggesting that the promised benefits for American workers didn't materialize. He acknowledges that the WTO wasn't the sole cause of these trends, but argues it failed to deliver on its promises. The author explains that the U.S. initially wanted a strong dispute system to fix the old GATT system, where rulings weren't enforced. However, other countries, particularly in Europe, saw it as a way to limit U.S. power. Lighthizer reveals that European officials openly admitted they wanted to check the U.S.'s influence. The WTO dispute system ended up exceeding expectations in undermining American power, with the U.S. facing more cases than any other country and losing the majority of them. He recalls a conversation with Ambassador Brock, where he warned that a binding system could backfire if the U.S. was more likely to be sued than to sue. Lighthizer emphasizes that the appellate body became overly powerful, creating its own rules and overstepping its boundaries. He describes how judges were highly paid and often extended their terms, creating a system prone to abuse. He points to specific cases where the appellate body interfered with U.S. laws on issues like taxes, environmental regulations, and national security, arguing that it undermined U.S. sovereignty. He cites Thomas Graham, a former appellate body member, who described a biased and self-serving culture within the organization. He details several cases where the appellate body ruled against the U.S., even when the rulings seemed to contradict the original intent of the WTO agreements. He uses the Boeing-Airbus case as an example of lengthy and unproductive litigation. He criticizes the appellate body for repeatedly finding fault with U.S. anti-dumping and anti-subsidy laws, making it harder to protect American industries from unfair competition. He also points out how the appellate body challenged U.S. national security decisions, a move he considers a dangerous overreach. Lighthizer argues that the WTO has failed to address China's unfair trade practices, and in some ways has even enabled its rise. He believes the WTO's negotiating function has stalled because countries prefer to pursue their interests through litigation. He calls for a reset of the global tariff system, an end to preferential trade agreements that undermine the most favored nation principle, and a reform of the special treatment given to developing countries. He proposes a new dispute settlement system based on commercial arbitration, with decisions subject to a vote by WTO members and not automatically binding. He concludes that the current WTO system is a failure and needs fundamental change. Chapter 5, Our Greatest Geopolitical Threat. Robert Lighthizer paints a stark picture of China as a major threat to the United States, a challenge he believes America helped create through decades of misguided policies. He argues that for too long, the U.S. acted as if China would naturally become a democratic partner, a belief he calls naive. Instead, China has steadily grown into a powerful, autocratic nation, actively working against American interests. Lighthizer emphasizes this isn't a new development. He believes the mask of a friendly, developing nation was never convincing. A key part of Lighthizer's argument centers on the economic imbalance between the two countries. He points out that China's economy has grown to be incredibly large, surpassing any previous competitor the U.S. has faced in the 20th century. Not even the combined power of Japan and Germany during World War II or the Soviet Union at its peak. This economic strength, he warns, directly translates into military power and global influence. He illustrates this with the example of China's rapid military buildup, exceeding the pace the U.S. is prepared for, and its aggressive actions in the South China Sea. Lighthizer is critical of past U.S. administrations, particularly the Clinton administration, for prioritizing engagement with China over protecting American interests. He recalls his concerns in 1999 about allowing China into the World Trade Organization, WTO, fearing it would give up valuable leverage. He believed that economic pressure should be used to influence China's behavior on issues like Taiwan, human rights in Tibet, and religious freedom. His fears proved correct, as the U.S. found itself with limited options to respond to China's actions once it became a WTO member. He uses the example of Smithfield Foods, an American meat processor, being bought by a Chinese company, to show how China has gained control over important parts of the U.S. economy. The author details how China initially used a strategy of hiding its capabilities and biding its time after the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989. This meant presenting a friendly face to the world while secretly building its power. Lighthizer suggests that Western leaders were too easily reassured, sometimes because Chinese money and support aligned with their own agendas. He believes this period allowed China to grow stronger without facing significant consequences for its actions. More recently, Lighthizer observes a shift in China's approach. He describes a new openness and even rudeness in interactions with the Biden administration, signaling a confidence born from its growing power. He points to the Chinese government's deliberate provocations and its willingness to openly challenge the U.S. The incident with the Chinese spy balloon flying over the United States is a prime example of this new assertiveness. He emphasizes that China's actions speak louder than its words, and the U.S. needs to pay close attention to what China does, not just what it says. Lighthizer also highlights China's unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, cyber attacks, and environmental disregard. He notes China's efforts to influence U.S. political and academic institutions, viewing them as a way to undermine American values and gain an advantage. He points to China's aggressive pursuit of military power, fueled by its economic strength, as a central component of its strategic plan. He draws a parallel to Mao Zedong's famous quote, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun," to emphasize the importance of military might in China's strategy. He expresses concern over China's increasing assertiveness in its surrounding regions, particularly in the South China Sea, and its use of economic threats to pressure other countries. He also points to China's role in the global fentanyl crisis, noting that the vast majority of the chemicals used to make the drug come from China. Lighthizer concludes that the U.S. is facing an openly hostile and powerful adversary and needs to recognize the gravity of the situation. He believes that maintaining the illusion of a peaceful, democratic China is no longer possible, and that a clear-eyed understanding of the threat is essential to protecting American interests and the future of the free world. Chapter 6, 21st Century Mercantilism, China's Economic System. Robert Lighthizer paints a clear picture of how the United States got into a tough spot with China, arguing that decades of trade policies were simply wrong. He believes that for too long, America acted as if China would naturally become a fair player in the global economy, and that simply wasn't happening. The author explains that after Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping introduced reforms, but these weren't about becoming a free market like the U.S. Instead, it was a carefully planned strategy to build up China's power, using a mix of state control and limited private enterprise. Many American leaders mistakenly believed this meant China was moving towards open markets, but Lighthizer argues they missed the bigger picture. China was always playing a different game. The core of China's strategy, according to Lighthizer, is mercantilism, a system where the government heavily controls the economy to become rich and powerful. He explains that this isn't like a normal economy, where businesses mostly make their own decisions. In China, the government picks winners and losers, gives unfair advantages to its own companies, and actively tries to steal technology from other countries. He uses the example of Westinghouse, an American nuclear power company, to illustrate this point. Westinghouse partnered with a Chinese company, hoping to build nuclear plants in China, but was forced to hand over valuable secrets. China then used this information to build its own nuclear technology, eventually pushing Westinghouse out of the market and even leading to the American company's bankruptcy. Lighthizer emphasizes this wasn't just bad luck, it was a deliberate strategy by China. Lighthizer details how China uses a variety of tools to gain an edge. These include subsidies basically, government handouts to companies, unfair trade rules, and even stealing intellectual property. He points out that China's state-owned enterprises, SOEs, are incredibly powerful and aren't held to the same standards as private companies in other countries. These SOEs get special treatment, making it hard for American businesses to compete. He also highlights the role of the Communist Party, which controls everything, including businesses, ensuring they follow the party's goals. The author explains that even companies that appear private in China are still under the government's thumb, forced to cooperate and follow its orders. The author stresses that China's economic growth isn't just about making money. It's about building up its military and increasing its influence around the world. He argues that the billions of dollars America sends to China each year are directly funding this expansion. Lighthizer explains that China's policies aren't new, they've been in place for decades, and they've allowed China to become a major economic and military power. He uses the saying, "Money is the sinews of war," to emphasize that economic strength is essential for military power, and China has been very successful in building both. Lighthizer also points out that China doesn't play by the rules when it comes to labor and the environment. He explains that Chinese workers are often exploited, with low wages and poor working conditions, giving Chinese companies an unfair cost advantage. At the same time, China has weak environmental regulations, allowing companies to pollute without consequences. This combination of cheap labor and lax environmental rules makes it even harder for American companies to compete. He argues that these practices aren't accidental. They're deliberate policies designed to benefit China at the expense of others. Throughout the chapter, Lighthizer makes it clear that the previous approach of hoping China would change on its own was a failure. He believes that America needs to adopt a new strategy that protects American workers and businesses and confronts China's unfair trade practices. He emphasizes that understanding how China's system works is the first step towards addressing the economic threat it poses. The author's narrative suggests a need for a more assertive approach, one that prioritizes American interests and challenges China's mercantilist policies head-on. Chapter 7, An Economic Threat. Robert Lighthizer recounts a history of American economic interactions with China, painting a picture of repeated patterns where U.S. companies willingly shared their best technology, only to be outcompeted by Chinese firms who then used that very technology against them. He illustrates this with stories like MagnaQuench, a company that made special magnets for missiles, initially funded by the U.S. government, but later bought and moved to China, losing American jobs and expertise. This wasn't an isolated case, Lighthizer argues, but a common theme American companies chasing profits in China through joint ventures, only to have their ideas stolen or copied, leading to their own decline. He emphasizes that this wasn't simply a matter of better competition, but of unfair practices and a deliberate strategy by the Chinese government. Lighthizer points out that even companies trying to protect their technology faced threats, citing instances of Chinese spies stealing trade secrets from major American corporations like Ford and Apple. He highlights the massive scale of this problem, estimating that intellectual property theft costs the U.S. over $300 billion each year. This theft wasn't just happening through hacking. It was built into the system of doing business in China, where companies were often pressured to share technology as a condition of operating there. He explains that China used tactics like requiring joint ventures with Chinese partners, manipulating licensing processes, and encouraging investment in U.S. companies specifically to gain access to valuable technology. The author details how China's government actively supports its own companies through subsidies and other advantages, creating an uneven playing field for American businesses. He describes how China's policies extend beyond just stealing ideas, encompassing unfair trade practices like tariffs, currency manipulation, and restrictions on foreign investment. He uses the example of the solar panel industry, where China heavily subsidized its manufacturers, driving down prices and forcing American companies out of business. Similarly, in shipbuilding and steel production, China's massive government support allowed it to dominate the global market, while the U.S. industry struggled. Lighthizer explains that the Trump administration recognized these issues and took action, specifically through something called Section 301, which allowed the U.S. to impose tariffs on Chinese goods in response to unfair trade practices. He details specific findings from a 2018 report that outlined how China pressured companies to transfer technology, forced unfair licensing terms, and supported the theft of intellectual property. He notes that while the Phase 1 trade deal with China brought some improvements, enforcement remained a challenge. Lighthizer emphasizes that China's success isn't accidental. It's the result of a deliberate strategy to become a global economic power, often at the expense of the United States. He points to China's increasing investment in research and development, its efforts to attract American scientists, and its growing dominance in key industries like semiconductors and electric vehicles. He argues that the U.S. has been losing ground in innovation and manufacturing, and that China is rapidly becoming the world's technological leader. He concludes by suggesting that the policies undertaken during the Trump administration were a necessary course correction, but that continued vigilance and action are needed to address the ongoing challenges posed by China's economic practices. Chapter 8, Changing the Direction. Robert Lighthizer recounts a pivotal trip to China in 2017, marking the beginning of a new approach to trade with the country. He details how previous administrations had, in his view, made mistakes by allowing China into the World Trade Organization, WTO, without securing strong guarantees for fair trade. He believed giving China permanent normal trade relations removed important leverage the U.S. once had, like the ability to threaten higher tariffs if China didn't play fair. Lighthizer argues this earlier policy of free trade had unintentionally hurt American businesses and workers. He explains that the WTO, while intended to be a fair referee, hadn't been effective in enforcing rules against China's unfair practices. The visit itself was filled with ceremony, a red carpet welcome, military parades, and a personal tour of the Forbidden City by President Xi. However, beneath the surface, Lighthizer describes a tense situation. President Trump had campaigned on fixing the trade imbalance with China, and despite a friendly personal relationship with Xi, Trump remained firm on this issue. Lighthizer notes that Trump was capable of being friendly with world leaders while still making tough decisions that were in America's best interest. The author explains that China had initially tried to charm Trump with gestures like his granddaughter singing in Mandarin, but the core issue of unfair trade practices remained. A key moment came during a meeting with Chinese officials. Lighthizer was unexpectedly asked to speak about trade without a prepared statement. He used this opportunity to directly address the Chinese leadership about issues like technology theft, weak intellectual property protection, and the large trade deficit. He wanted them to understand how these practices were hurting the American economy and its workers. This directness was unusual and caught the Chinese off guard, as it wasn't the typical diplomatic approach. Lighthizer felt it was important to explain the American perspective and why the existing trade relationship was unsustainable. Lighthizer believed a major error had been made in 2001, when China was allowed to join the WTO without sufficient safeguards. He felt the U.S. had given up too much leverage in the process. He decided to revive a legal tool called Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allowed the president to impose tariffs on countries engaging in unfair trade practices. This hadn't been used effectively in years, partly because of agreements made during previous trade negotiations. Lighthizer saw Section 301 as a way to address China's systemic unfair practices and protect American industries. He explains that previous attempts to resolve issues through the WTO had been slow and ineffective. The author details how he launched an investigation into China's trade practices, focusing on technology theft and intellectual property issues. This investigation led to the imposition of tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. China retaliated with its own tariffs, but Lighthizer believed this was a necessary step to force China to the negotiating table. He wanted to move beyond simply complaining about unfair practices, and actually take action to change them. He emphasizes that the goal wasn't just about trade numbers, but about creating a level playing field for American workers and businesses. Lighthizer describes a series of meetings with Chinese Vice Premier Liu He, where he pushed for structural changes to China's economic system. He resisted attempts by the Chinese to focus on short-term deals involving purchases of U.S. goods, arguing that real change required addressing the underlying issues of forced technology transfer and intellectual property theft. He explains that the Chinese initially tried to categorize issues into green light, yellow light, and red light categories, with many of the most important issues falling into the red light category, meaning they were unwilling to negotiate on them. The climax of this initial phase came at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires, where Presidents Trump and Xi met. Lighthizer recounts the intense preparation for the meeting and the discussions with the president about strategy. Ultimately, the two presidents agreed to a 90-day pause in the tariff increases, during which time negotiations would continue. China committed to purchasing more U.S. goods and to begin negotiations on the structural issues Lighthizer had been pushing for. However, Lighthizer notes that the arrest of Huawei's CFO, Meng Wanzhou, on the same night as the dinner added a new layer of complexity to the situation. He concludes by stating that the real work of negotiating a lasting agreement with China was just beginning, and he would be leading the effort. Chapter 9, Beginning to Negotiate. Robert Lighthizer recounts a period of intense negotiations, with China following a meeting between President Trump and President Xi in Buenos Aires. The core of Lighthizer's mission, as he describes it, was to correct what he saw as decades of failed policies regarding trade, particularly with China. He believed previous administrations hadn't been strong enough in demanding fair trade practices, which had hurt American workers and businesses. He felt the U.S. had been too trusting, allowing China to benefit unfairly. Lighthizer quickly discovered that getting China to follow through on promises was a major challenge. While Chinese officials seemed willing to negotiate, commitments made during talks often faced resistance when reviewed by leaders in Beijing. This pattern, Lighthizer explains, was a familiar tactic making agreements that weren't truly binding. He knew the U.S. needed to demonstrate a new level of seriousness to achieve real change. He wanted to show China that empty promises wouldn't work anymore. The initial proposal from Vice Premier Liu included purchases of U.S. farm products like soybeans and rice, a reduction in auto tariffs, and approval of biotechnology imports. However, Lighthizer was most concerned with ensuring any agreement could be enforced. He points out that China had a history of agreeing to trade rules and then not following them. He emphasized this point repeatedly, wanting a clear plan to hold China accountable. This was a key difference from past approaches, where enforcement was often weak or non-existent. Lighthizer stressed the need for a trade relationship based on fairness, reciprocity, and balance. He argued that the U.S. wasn't making demands, but rather seeking the same conditions it offered to other trading partners. This meant addressing issues like forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, and unfair market access. He believed these structural issues were crucial for a long-term, healthy trade relationship. He wanted to level the playing field for American companies. The meetings themselves were carefully staged to emphasize the importance of the negotiations. Lighthizer chose a grand room for the opening session, signaling the seriousness of the occasion. He even quoted Confucius, highlighting the importance of judging people by their actions, not just their words. This underscored his skepticism about China's past commitments. Throughout the negotiations, Lighthizer focused on specific issues. He challenged China's practice of requiring foreign companies to share technology with Chinese firms, a process he called forced technology transfer. He also raised concerns about intellectual property theft and the lack of protection for American inventions. He wanted stronger laws and penalties to deter these practices. He believed protecting American innovation was vital. Enforcement remained a sticking point. while China proposed a discussion-based process, Lighthizer insisted on a clear mechanism for determining violations and imposing consequences. He was wary of relying on neutral Chinese arbitrators and rejected the idea of third-country judges. He wanted the U.S. to have the authority to take action when China didn't meet its obligations. As the negotiations progressed, Lighthizer noticed a pattern. Chinese officials would agree to certain terms during talks, but those commitments would later be weakened or reversed due to internal pressures within the Chinese government. He suspected that hardliners within the Communist Party and bureaucratic interests were undermining Vice Premier Liu's efforts. He understood that Liu was navigating a complex political landscape. Despite these challenges, Lighthizer believed progress was being made. They discussed issues like subsidies, excess capacity in industries like steel, and China's policies on data security. However, he also recognized that certain areas, like access to the Chinese cloud computing market, were particularly sensitive for China. He felt any issue that could potentially limit the Communist Party's control was off limits. Lighthizer and his team drafted memorandums of understanding, MOUs, outlining the agreed-upon terms. However, when presented to China, the Chinese side attempted to backtrack on several key commitments. This led to further negotiations and frustration for the U.S. team. Lighthizer felt China was repeating its pattern of making promises it didn't intend to keep. President Trump became involved, expressing his skepticism about MOUs and preferring a more formal, binding agreement. This led to a public exchange between Trump and Lighthizer, but ultimately, they agreed to call the final document a trade agreement. Despite the progress, the negotiations ultimately stalled when China demanded the complete removal of all tariffs and sought to weaken key provisions of the agreement. Lighthizer felt China was unwilling to make the necessary structural changes to address the long-standing trade imbalances and unfair practices. Ultimately, Lighthizer describes a breakdown in negotiations, leading to the imposition of increased tariffs by the U.S. He concludes that China showed no intention of changing its behavior and that the tariffs were necessary to pressure China and protect American interests. He believed the U.S. needed to take a firm stance to address the unfair trade practices and ensure a more balanced relationship. Chapter 10, Making a Deal Concrete. Robert Lighthizer recounts a period of intense negotiations with China, beginning in mid-2019, driven by a belief that previous U.S. administrations had been too lenient and that free trade policies hadn't benefited American workers. He details a series of meetings with President Trump and Chinese President Xi, highlighting a pattern he observed. China would agree to things, then later backpedal or reinterpret the agreements to their advantage. Lighthizer felt this demonstrated a need for a different approach, one where commitments were written down and strictly enforced. He believed past administrations hadn't understood this dynamic, and the use of tariffs was a key shift in strategy. The author explains that the tariffs weren't just about money, they were about changing the economic relationship. He argues that the U.S. had become too reliant on China, and the tariffs were meant to reduce that dependence. He points out that while China initially resisted, the tariffs did have an effect, prompting them to make some concessions, like agreeing to purchase more American agricultural products. However, Lighthizer quickly notes that even these agreements were often followed by attempts to renegotiate or redefine the terms. For example, after agreeing to significant agricultural purchases, China claimed the agreement only meant they would discuss possible purchases, not actually make them. Lighthizer describes a frustrating cycle of negotiations, where Chinese officials would repeatedly raise unrelated issues, like the treatment of Chinese students in the U.S. or the situation with Huawei, to distract from the core trade concerns. He saw this as a tactic to muddy the waters and avoid addressing the fundamental problems of unfair trade practices. He emphasizes the importance of balance in the negotiations, arguing that the U.S. had been treated unfairly for too long regarding issues like forced technology transfer and intellectual property theft. He illustrates this with the example of Huawei, where despite President Trump's willingness to consider allowing some exports, China insisted on a complete removal from the entity list, a demand Lighthizer resisted. The narrative continues with a focus on the implementation of tariffs and China's retaliatory measures. Lighthizer details how, after the Osaka meeting, further tariffs were imposed, and China responded in kind. He explains that President Trump, unlike previous leaders, was willing to escalate the situation, believing it was necessary to get China to address the unfair practices. He recounts how American companies pleaded for delays in the tariffs, fearing the impact on consumers, and how the administration partially accommodated these requests by phasing in the tariffs over time. This demonstrates a balancing act between applying pressure on China and minimizing harm to American businesses and consumers. Lighthizer highlights the difficulties in reaching a comprehensive agreement, leading to the decision to pursue a Phase 1 deal. This deal focused on areas where progress was most likely, such as intellectual property, agriculture, and currency manipulation. He stresses that the tariffs remained in place throughout these negotiations, providing leverage for the U.S. He details the painstaking process of negotiating the details of the agreement, particularly the enforcement mechanisms, which he considered crucial. He explains that the U.S. insisted on having the right to determine whether China had violated the agreement and to take action in response, rather than relying on international panels. The author emphasizes that the Phase 1 agreement wasn't just about purchases. It included significant structural changes to China's economic practices. He points to commitments on intellectual property protection, forced technology transfer, and financial services as examples. He acknowledges that China initially resisted these changes, but ultimately agreed to them. He also notes that the agreement was a departure from past approaches, where agreements were often vague and unenforceable. He describes the final stages of negotiation, including a dispute over the translation of the agreement into Chinese, where the choice of words could significantly alter the meaning. Lighthizer concludes by arguing that the Section 301 tariffs and the Phase 1 agreement were successful in shifting the U.S.-China relationship. He claims that they reduced U.S. dependence on China, encouraged companies to diversify their supply chains, and forced China to address some of its unfair trade practices. He dismisses criticisms that the tariffs were a failure, pointing to the decline in imports of sensitive technologies and the increased awareness of the risks of relying on China. He believes that the Trump administration fundamentally changed the way Americans think about China, moving away from the idea of integrating China into the global system without addressing its problematic behavior. He asserts that the tariffs were a necessary step to protect American workers and national interests, even if they were unpopular with some. Chapter 11, The Way Forward. Robert Lighthizer argues that for a long time, the United States got it wrong when it came to China. He believes many people wrongly thought that if America traded with China, it would become more like us, more open and democratic. He points to the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party in October 2022 as a clear sign that this didn't happen. Instead, China doubled down on being a Marxist-Leninist country, meaning the government controls things tightly. Lighthizer explains that the idea that trade would change China was a mistake, and now China is determined to control its own path, even if it means being different from the West. The author contends that China is now aiming for more control over everything, especially businesses. He says the policies of Deng Xiaoping, which allowed some capitalism to help grow the country, are over. Now, the Chinese Communist Party wants to be in charge of more and more, and the tone coming from China is becoming more aggressive, almost like preparing for a conflict. Lighthizer emphasizes that the official translations of Chinese statements often soften the language for Western audiences, so it's important to look at more honest translations, like those provided by Kevin Rudd, a former Australian Prime Minister who speaks Mandarin. Rudd's translation showed a shift in focus away from peace and development and towards preparing for trouble and a willingness to fight for what they want. Lighthizer believes the new leaders chosen by Xi Jinping show that there will be no one challenging his ideas. He notes that all the top officials are strong supporters of Xi, and there's a lack of people with different viewpoints or experience in foreign policy or economic reform. This, according to Lighthizer, makes China a lethal adversary and requires the United States to change its approach. He calls for strategic decoupling, which means reducing our economic dependence on China. He doesn't want to cut off trade completely, but rather to make sure trade benefits America and its workers, farmers, and businesses, and to stop trade that harms us. The author highlights that the Trump administration started this process, recognizing China as a strategic competitor, and understanding that economic strength is also national security. Lighthizer explains that America has given China about $6 trillion more in trade than we've received back, and this needs to be rebalanced. He suggests things like lowering taxes, reducing unnecessary rules, and supporting American industries, pointing to the CHIPS and Science Act as a good step towards making America a leader in technology again. However, he believes this isn't enough, and that strong trade policies are needed to force China to trade more fairly. Lighthizer proposes removing China's most favored nation status, which would mean they'd have to pay higher taxes on goods they send to the U.S. He also suggests using tariffs taxes on imports to encourage balanced trade. He acknowledges that China and some businesses would complain, but believes the benefits to American workers and the country would be worth it. He points out that China's options for retaliation are limited because they don't buy as much from us. He also suggests making it easier for American companies to fight back against unfair trade practices by China and reducing our reliance on China for important goods like medicines and technology. The author stresses the need to control investment between the two countries. He argues that American money helps China, while China only invests in the U.S. when it benefits their strategic goals. He wants to strengthen the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, to block more Chinese investments that could harm America. He also wants to create rules to stop American companies from investing in China, especially in areas like artificial intelligence that could help China's military. Lighthizer believes America also needs to control what technology it exports to China, preventing them from getting sensitive information that could be used against us. Lighthizer emphasizes the importance of stopping technology interdependence, meaning we shouldn't be relying on each other for important technologies. He wants America to make these technologies ourselves or get them from allies, not China. He also wants to ensure that China has the same access to the U.S. market as American companies have in China, and he believes social media apps like TikTok should be banned because they could be used by the Chinese government to gather information and spread propaganda. Finally, Lighthizer calls for laws to stop China from trying to influence American politics and society through advertising, funding universities, and controlling social media algorithms. Lighthizer concludes by saying that China is already moving towards this kind of separation, which they call decoupling with Chinese characteristics. He believes America can succeed in this competition, just like it did with Japan in the past, by focusing on its own economic strength and adopting sensible policies. He believes that with the right approach, America can and will prevail. Chapter 12, From NAFTA to USMCA, The Great Issues. Robert Lighthizer recounts a time when many people believed in free trade agreements, but he argues these policies didn't always work as planned. He points to NAFTA as a prime example. Initially, the Clinton administration promised to fix NAFTA, but ended up making only small changes while pushing it through Congress. Lighthizer believes history proved Ross Perot right. The agreement did lead to American jobs moving to Mexico, creating what Perot famously called a giant sucking sound. While some businesses, like those in agriculture, benefited, many American factory workers suffered job losses and had less power to negotiate for better wages and benefits. Companies threatened to move to Mexico to get workers to accept less, and sometimes even had American workers train their replacements. Lighthizer explains that NAFTA's impact on Mexico wasn't entirely positive either. While some Mexican workers found jobs in factories, others were left struggling, and some even turned to illegal activities. The idea that NAFTA would bring American-style democracy to Mexico didn't pan out either, with corruption and violence continuing to be major problems. To make matters worse, NAFTA coincided with China joining the World Trade Organization, meaning American workers now had to compete with even more low-cost labor. Lighthizer notes that predictions of rising wages in both the U.S. and Mexico didn't come true, and any wealth created in Mexico largely benefited a small group of people, who then bought goods from China, not the United States. He suggests that the situation might have been different if NAFTA and China's entry into the WTO hadn't happened at the same time. When Donald Trump became president, he promised to change NAFTA, calling it the worst agreement ever. Lighthizer, as the U.S. trade representative, was tasked with making that happen. He knew simply canceling NAFTA would be disastrous, disrupting the economy and upsetting many people, including Trump's own supporters. Instead, he aimed to overhaul the agreement, satisfying the president, voters, and Congress, while also gaining acceptance from Canada and Mexico. A major problem Lighthizer identified was the auto industry. NAFTA's rules allowed cars to qualify for duty-free treatment, even if most of their parts came from outside North America. He explains this was like a loophole, letting companies from Europe and Asia assemble cars in Mexico and sell them in the U.S. without paying taxes. To fix this, Lighthizer proposed increasing the amount of North American content required in cars to 75% and eliminating the loophole that allowed parts to be deemed to originate in North America. He also added a requirement that a significant portion of car parts be made by workers earning at least $16 an hour, aiming to bring jobs back to the U.S. and improve wages. Lighthizer also focused on labor issues in Mexico. Historically, Mexican unions were often controlled by the government and businesses, leading to low wages and poor working conditions. He pushed for changes to Mexican law to ensure workers could freely choose their unions and negotiate fair contracts. This was a significant step, as it aimed to level the playing field for American workers and prevent companies from exploiting cheap labor in Mexico. Beyond autos and labor, Lighthizer addressed other issues, like Canada's protectionist dairy policies and concerns about intellectual property theft. He also wanted to address the growing influence of China. He proposed rules to discourage countries from making trade deals with non-market economies like China, fearing it would undermine the benefits of the new agreement. Ultimately, the negotiations led to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which Lighthizer believes addresses many of the flaws of NAFTA and better protects American workers and businesses. He emphasizes that the new agreement includes a sunset clause, meaning it will expire after a certain period unless the countries agree to renew it, forcing regular reviews and updates to ensure it continues to serve their interests. Chapter 13, USMCA, Mexico and Canada. Robert Lighthizer believed that NAFTA, a previous trade deal, hadn't worked well for America. He felt it had caused many Americans to lose jobs, and he made it a top priority to fix this. When he started the negotiations to improve the deal, which eventually became USMCA, he knew it wouldn't be easy. He didn't just have to talk to Mexico and Canada, but also to people in the U.S. Congress, businesses, workers, and others who had opinions on the matter. All of this was happening while the Trump administration was dealing with other big issues like taxes, healthcare, and problems with immigration. Lighthizer understood that if the negotiations failed, it would be a big problem for the president, the Republican Party, and the country as a whole. From the very beginning, Lighthizer took a firm stance. Unlike his counterparts from Mexico and Canada, who praised NAFTA, he openly criticized it. He explained that the agreement had let down many American workers, and that a simple update wouldn't be enough. He wanted a complete change to make things fairer for the U.S. He made it clear that President Trump wasn't looking for a quick win to celebrate, but a real improvement for American workers, farmers, and businesses. This strong position immediately signaled that the negotiations would be tough. Lighthizer recognized that trade talks often drag on without a clear end date, making it hard to know when to reveal what each side really wants. To avoid this, he tried to create a deadline tied to the 2018 midterm elections. He hoped to get the new agreement approved by Congress before the elections, when the president's party still had control. However, he soon realized that Canada and Mexico weren't in a hurry, and they underestimated President Trump's determination to withdraw from NAFTA if necessary. Lighthizer observed that Canada and Mexico were trying to influence members of Congress to pressure the administration into backing down from its demands, hoping to avoid major changes. He pointed out that the Republican Party had changed, and many voters who supported President Trump felt differently about trade than older Republican leaders. To put more pressure on Canada and Mexico, President Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, citing national security concerns. While Canada and Mexico were initially exempt, the president later added these tariffs when they wouldn't agree to limits on their exports to the U.S. He also announced a potential investigation into auto imports, which would have been even more damaging to Canada and Mexico. Lighthizer explained that these actions were meant to show that the U.S. was serious about changing the trade relationship. These moves created tension, especially during a G7 meeting where President Trump clashed with Prime Minister Trudeau. The situation became even more complicated when Mexico held presidential elections and Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, was elected. Lighthizer was worried because AMLO was also a nationalist who didn't necessarily support NAFTA. However, AMLO appointed Jesus Seed as his representative, and Seed had a history of working with Lighthizer. Seed assured Lighthizer that AMLO was willing to support the new agreement, but only if it was finalized before the current Mexican president's term ended. This created a very tight deadline. Lighthizer and his team worked tirelessly to reach an agreement, focusing on key issues like the rules for auto manufacturing and labor rights. They eventually reached a deal with Mexico, but Canada remained hesitant. After much negotiation, and with the help of Jared Kushner and other political advisors, Canada finally agreed to join the deal just before the deadline. Lighthizer emphasized that President Trump had always supported his efforts throughout the challenging negotiations. He believed the USMCA was a significant improvement over NAFTA and would benefit American workers. Throughout the process, Lighthizer was mindful of the broader context of the Trump administration's trade policies, particularly its approach to China. While not explicitly detailed in this excerpt, the author's overall goal was to rebalance trade relationships to favor American workers and businesses, and to challenge what he perceived as unfair trade practices by countries like China. The USMCA negotiations were a key part of this larger strategy. Chapter 14, Round 2 of USMCA, On to Congress. Robert Lighthizer recounts his experience negotiating the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, framing it as a correction to decades of trade policies he believed had harmed American workers. He begins by establishing a respectful, yet pragmatic, relationship with Speaker Nancy Pelosi, despite their significant political differences. Lighthizer notes their shared background, both raised in Catholic schools and educated in Washington, D.C., fostered a level of mutual respect that proved crucial during tense negotiations. He highlights that both were products of a different era of politics, where collaboration across party lines wasn't uncommon. Lighthizer's critique of past free trade deals, specifically NAFTA, is central to his narrative. He details how Pelosi herself regretted supporting the original NAFTA, feeling betrayed when promised labor protections didn't materialize. This shared disappointment became a starting point for USMCA negotiations. He explains that NAFTA, while intended to boost trade, ultimately allowed companies to move jobs to Mexico where labor was cheaper, hurting American workers. He also points out that the side agreements meant to protect workers were essentially useless. Lighthizer had long been critical of China's trade practices, even before it became a mainstream concern, and accurately predicted they wouldn't follow international trade rules. This history informed his approach to USMCA, aiming for an agreement that genuinely benefited American workers and addressed past failures. The author emphasizes the difficulty of navigating the Trade Promotion Authority (TPA) process, which was supposed to streamline trade agreement approvals, but in reality created more hurdles. He explains that while TPA aimed to limit debate, Speaker Pelosi's power to control the House calendar meant she could effectively pause the process whenever she wanted. This meant success depended entirely on reaching an agreement with her and securing the support of House Democrats. Lighthizer actively engaged with various congressional groups, from the New Democrats to the Freedom Caucus, but recognized the House Democratic Caucus held the key to USMCA's fate. He even appeared before the entire Democratic Caucus twice, a rare occurrence for a Trump administration official, demonstrating his commitment to direct engagement. Lighthizer describes the formation of a USMCA working group led by Representative Richie Neal, comprised of diverse Democrats representing a wide range of viewpoints. He acknowledges the initial skepticism from his staff, fearing the speaker would derail the entire process. However, Pelosi reassured his deputy, CJ, that a deal could be reached. The core of the negotiations revolved around strengthening labor enforcement, improving environmental protections, and addressing concerns about prescription drug prices. Lighthizer's primary demand was a dedicated group to negotiate the specifics. The most challenging aspect of the negotiations, according to Lighthizer, was labor enforcement. Previous agreements had unenforceable labor provisions. While USMCA included a dispute settlement system, it had a flaw. A country could block the formation of a panel by refusing to appoint arbitrators. Democrats and labor unions wanted a stronger mechanism, the ability to block imports from facilities violating labor standards. Lighthizer initially resisted, wary of giving the U.S. too much unilateral power over Mexico, but ultimately agreed to a rapid response mechanism, allowing targeted enforcement actions at individual worksites. He acknowledges the difficulty in convincing both sides, particularly Mexican officials, to accept this new system, but highlights the crucial role of Catherine Tai, who would later become his successor, in bridging the gap. Lighthizer details a final concession he made to secure the deal, dropping a provision protecting data exclusivity for biologic drugs. This provision was important to pharmaceutical companies, but Democrats prioritized lowering prescription drug costs. While he disagreed with their reasoning, he prioritized securing the overall agreement. He credits Speaker Pelosi and Chairman Neal for maintaining a disciplined negotiation process, keeping discussions confidential and building trust. He also praises Rich Trumka, the JFL-CIO president, for his willingness to work towards a deal that prioritized American workers, even if it meant giving President Trump a political win. The author concludes by emphasizing the importance of direct engagement with stakeholders, bypassing lobbyists and speaking directly with business leaders. He found that CEOs were more reasonable than their lobbyists. He also stresses the value of compartmentalization in politics, maintaining a working relationship with Pelosi despite their political clashes. Lighthizer believes USMCA represented a significant shift in trade policy, prioritizing workers and setting a new standard for future agreements. He views the overwhelming bipartisan support for USMCA as a validation of his approach and a testament to the power of collaboration. Chapter 15, Europe and Japan. Robert Lighthizer paints a picture of decades of trade policies that, in his view, didn't quite work out for the United States. He believes that for a long time, the U.S. entered into trade deals that weren't balanced, essentially letting other countries benefit more than America did. He specifically points to the idea that previous administrations didn't push hard enough for fair deals, resulting in growing trade deficits, meaning the U.S. bought more from other countries than it sold to them. This imbalance, Lighthizer argues, led to a transfer of wealth away from American workers and businesses. He stresses that being friends with other countries doesn't mean you can't also address unfair trade practices. A major focus for Lighthizer was correcting the economic relationship with Europe. While acknowledging the strong alliance, he details how the U.S. trade deficit with the European Union steadily grew over the years. He explains this wasn't simply a matter of different economies, but a result of unfair practices like higher tariffs imposed by Europe on American goods, especially cars. He uses the example of a $50,000 car facing a $3,700 tariff difference, highlighting the significant cost disadvantage for U.S. manufacturers. He also points out that Europe uses strict product standards, sometimes unnecessarily, to make it harder for American products to compete. Attempts to fix this through a large trade agreement, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, failed because Europe wasn't willing to give up its ability to protect its own industries. Lighthizer also criticizes the value-added tax, VAT, system used in Europe, which he believes puts American exporters at a disadvantage. He further notes that Europe heavily subsidizes its agriculture and industries, like Airbus, giving them an unfair edge. He believes President Trump was right to be concerned about this growing imbalance. Lighthizer also addresses the issue of Japan, recalling a time when its economic success was seen as a miracle, but built on unfair trade practices. He describes how Japan intentionally kept its markets closed while aggressively exporting goods to the U.S. He recounts his experiences negotiating with Japan during the Reagan administration, even sharing a story about dramatically demonstrating his dissatisfaction with a Japanese offer by folding it into a paper airplane. He explains how Japan's policies, like government subsidies and an undervalued currency, helped them build a large trade surplus with the U.S. While acknowledging that Japan had become a more reliable ally by his time as USDR, Lighthizer still pushed for a more balanced trade relationship, ultimately securing greater access to the Japanese market for American agricultural products. Throughout the chapter, Lighthizer consistently emphasizes the importance of prioritizing American workers and businesses. He defends the use of tariffs, like those on steel and aluminum, as necessary to protect vital industries and national security. He explains that these tariffs weren't about isolationism, but about creating a level playing field and encouraging other countries to address unfair practices. He highlights President Trump's willingness to stand up for American interests, even when it meant challenging long-held assumptions about free trade. He also describes forming a trilateral group with Japan and the European Union to jointly address unfair trade practices by China, signaling a shift towards a more unified front against what he sees as a major economic threat. Lighthizer's narrative reveals a clear belief that traditional free trade policies had failed to deliver for the United States. He advocates for a more assertive approach, focused on negotiating fairer deals, protecting American industries, and holding countries accountable for their trade practices. He frames his actions not as protectionism, but as a necessary correction to decades of imbalance and a commitment to supporting American workers and businesses. He portrays a consistent theme of challenging the status quo and prioritizing American economic interests above all else. Chapter 16: Other Major Trading Partners. Robert Lighthizer details a period marked by a clear shift away from what he considered failed free trade policies, a determined effort to address imbalances with China, and a consistent focus on supporting American workers. He argues that previous administrations had prioritized global agreements over the needs of the U.S. economy, leading to significant trade deficits and job losses. Lighthizer's first trip as U.S. Trade Representative to Vietnam in 2017 symbolized this change. While acknowledging the importance of continued engagement with the Asia-Pacific region after the U.S. withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, he aimed to signal a new approach, one that wouldn't automatically sacrifice American industries for the sake of international cooperation. He wanted to show the world the U.S. understood its role in the Pacific but would now prioritize fair trade. Lighthizer explains that the traditional pattern at these international trade meetings involved simply updating old agreements, but he rejected this approach. He directed his team to refuse any language that didn't align with the Trump administration's new trade policies. This meant moving away from a commitment to open economies at all costs and challenging the authority of the World Trade Organization. He directly confronted Asian trade ministers about the large trade surpluses they held with the U.S., abandoning the usual diplomatic language about regional integration. This directness, he believed, was necessary to demonstrate the U.S. was serious about achieving balanced trade, even if it meant taking strong action on its own. The author highlights the complexities of dealing with India, a country with which the U.S. shared democratic values and a growing strategic partnership against China. Despite this potential for cooperation, Lighthizer found India deeply committed to protectionist policies, high tariffs, bureaucratic hurdles, and support for domestic industries. He points out that India's economic growth, while impressive, hadn't translated into a more open market for U.S. goods. He describes a tense exchange with Prime Minister Modi during a G7 meeting, where Lighthizer forcefully argued that India was the most protectionist country in the world, and that its policies were hurting American workers. While the relationship remained cordial, Lighthizer made it clear that concessions were needed for a trade deal to be reached. He ultimately concluded that India's protectionism was ingrained in its political and economic system, requiring a more assertive, unilateral approach from the U.S. Lighthizer also discusses the renegotiation of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, KORUS. He asserts that the original agreement, negotiated under the Bush administration and later supported by President Obama, had led to a significant increase in the U.S. trade deficit with South Korea. President Trump, true to his campaign promises, threatened to withdraw from the agreement if it wasn't revised. Lighthizer details the difficult negotiations with Korean officials, emphasizing the importance of securing better access for U.S. automobiles and postponing the elimination of tariffs on small trucks, a key sector for American manufacturing. He describes the Korean team's relentless efforts to reach a deal, and the eventual success in modifying KORUS to address some of the imbalances. He believes the renegotiated agreement demonstrated that an America First trade policy could work, helping U.S. industry and reducing the trade deficit. Finally, Lighthizer turns to Vietnam, a country that had transformed from a wartime adversary into a major trading partner with a massive and growing trade surplus with the U.S. He points out that a significant portion of Vietnam's exports to the U.S. may have actually been products originating in China, disguised to avoid tariffs. He initiated a Section 301 investigation into Vietnam's currency valuation practices, accusing the country of manipulating its currency to gain an unfair trade advantage. However, he notes that the Biden administration later backed down from taking action, signaling a shift away from the more aggressive stance of the Trump administration. Lighthizer expresses disappointment with this decision, viewing it as a missed opportunity to address unfair trade practices and protect American jobs. Throughout the chapter, Lighthizer consistently frames his actions as a necessary correction to decades of failed free trade policies, a determined effort to confront China's unfair trade practices, and a steadfast commitment to supporting American workers and industries. Chapter 17, Transcending Issues That Affect the Economy. Robert Lighthizer paints a picture of the American economy struggling under the weight of policies he believes favored global trade over American jobs and businesses. He argues that for decades, the United States has been operating under a system that unintentionally hurts its own manufacturers and workers, particularly when competing with countries like China. A major part of the problem, according to Lighthizer, is the floating value of the U.S. dollar. He explains that normally, a country selling more than it buys should see its currency get stronger, making its goods more expensive for others to buy. But this hasn't happened with the U.S., even with huge trade deficits, because people around the world see the dollar as a safe place to put their money, especially during tough times. This keeps the dollar's value artificially high, making American products more expensive and harder to sell overseas. Lighthizer also points to a difference in how countries collect taxes. Most of the world uses a value-added tax, or VAT, which is added to the price of a product at each stage of its creation. When a product is exported, that tax is refunded, making it cheaper for buyers in other countries. The U.S., however, relies mostly on income tax, which isn't refunded on exports. This puts American companies at a disadvantage, as their products are effectively more expensive when sold abroad. He illustrates this with a simple example. A French machine can be sold in the U.S. for less than an American machine because of this tax difference. He acknowledges economists argue the currency should adjust to fix this, but he insists it hasn't, and the situation continues to harm American businesses. A significant part of Lighthizer's concern centers on China's economic practices. He details how China actively works to boost its own tech industry, sometimes through unfair methods like forcing companies to share technology or stealing intellectual property. He warns that Europe is starting to follow a similar path, creating barriers to American tech companies under the guise of protecting privacy and security. He uses the example of France requiring cloud service providers to have a French partner, which he sees as a way to learn American technology and eventually compete against it. Lighthizer stresses the importance of protecting American data, both from theft by countries like China and from unfair access by foreign governments. He advocates for stronger rules and enforcement to safeguard American innovation. The auto industry receives specific attention from Lighthizer. He notes that the U.S. has lower tariffs on cars than many other countries, and that factors like lower labor costs and currency manipulation have given foreign automakers an advantage. He highlights actions taken during the Trump administration to address these issues, including tariffs on Chinese cars, renegotiating trade agreements like NAFTA, now USMCA, to require more manufacturing in North America, and pushing back against unfair trade practices with Korea. These changes, he argues, helped save American jobs and reduce the trade deficit. Lighthizer also tackles a little-known loophole called de minimis, which allows small packages to enter the U.S. duty-free. While originally intended for small gifts, he explains that companies, particularly those based in China, are exploiting this rule to ship large volumes of goods into the U.S. without paying taxes. He uses the example of Shein, a fast fashion company which has rapidly grown by taking advantage of this loophole. He argues this hurts American manufacturers, makes it harder to enforce safety standards, and gives foreign companies an unfair advantage. He calls for changes to this rule, especially for countries that don't offer similar benefits to the U.S. Throughout the chapter, Lighthizer consistently frames these issues as a need to prioritize American workers and businesses, and to push back against what he sees as unfair trade practices that have weakened the U.S. economy. He believes a stronger, more assertive approach to trade is essential for America's future. Chapter 18, A Prescription for the Future. Robert Lighthizer argues that for many years, America's trade policies didn't work well for everyday people. He believes that in the 1990s and early 2000s, leaders followed a plan of free trade that sounded good but actually hurt American factories and workers. Instead of creating more jobs and higher pay, this plan led to many factories closing and important products, like the materials needed for phones and computers, being made in other countries. Lighthizer explains that it became harder for people to move up in life, and many towns that once had thriving industries fell into hard times, with problems like job losses and drug abuse. He stresses that America needs to focus on making things again, not just buying them from other countries. Lighthizer emphasizes that the future of the country depends on changing how it approaches trade. He believes America needs a trade plan that puts American workers first. While things like low prices and company profits are important, they shouldn't be more important than helping families and communities. To compete with China and be successful, America needs to use trade to help its own people. He points out that the Trump administration started to change things, like turning a large ship in a new direction, but it takes time to change how businesses and people think. According to Lighthizer, the Trump administration took strong action against China, raising taxes on Chinese goods to fight unfair trade practices. He explains that they increased these taxes on over $400 billion worth of imports, much more than previous administrations. They didn't just target China, but also any country that had an unfair advantage. They also updated the NAFTA agreement, now called USMCA, to encourage more manufacturing in America and added rules to protect the environment and workers' rights. Lighthizer highlights that they also changed rules so trade agreements wouldn't last forever, allowing them to be updated when needed. He uses the example of a worker losing their job because of an old trade deal that no longer makes sense. Lighthizer notes that these changes led to positive results. The trade deficit, which is when a country buys more than it sells, went down. Millions of jobs were created, including hundreds of thousands in manufacturing. Wages increased, and the stock market did well. Most importantly, family incomes rose to a record high. He believes the Trump administration laid the groundwork for a new approach to trade that benefits American workers. He also acknowledges that the Biden administration has continued some of these policies, like keeping the taxes on Chinese goods and starting to support American industries. However, Lighthizer warns that China remains a major threat to the United States, not just economically, but also politically. He believes China sees America as an enemy and is using the money it receives from trade with the U.S. to build up its military and challenge America's influence around the world. He states that China has built the world's largest navy and army with money from the U.S. He argues that America needs to reduce its economic ties with China, especially in important areas like technology. He suggests stopping China from investing in the U.S. and limiting what technology is shared with them. For example, he believes drones and computers should be made in America or by allies without any Chinese parts. Lighthizer also points out that other countries sometimes treat American businesses unfairly. He believes America should demand fair trade from all its partners and be willing to take action if they don't cooperate. He suggests using existing trade laws to fight unfair practices and being prepared to impose taxes on countries that don't give American businesses equal access to their markets. He also proposes changing import laws to require that imported goods meet the same standards for things like worker rights and environmental protection as American-made goods. He uses the example of a carbon tax on imports, meaning goods made with a lot of pollution would be more expensive. Lighthizer believes America should also support key industries through subsidies, which are like financial boosts from the government. While he generally doesn't like subsidies, he argues that they are necessary in certain areas where America can't compete without them, like the production of computer chips. He explains that America invented computer chips, but is now falling behind because other countries provide large subsidies to their chip makers. He supports the CHIPS and Science Act, which provides funding for American chip manufacturing. Finally, Lighthizer stresses the importance of balancing trade, meaning America should aim to sell as much as it buys. He believes that running large trade deficits weakens the country. He suggests several ways to achieve this balance, including requiring importers to prove they export an equal value of goods from the U.S., putting a fee on foreign investment, or imposing tariffs on imports. He believes tariffs are the simplest and most predictable option. He acknowledges that these changes will take time, but believes they are necessary to protect American workers and ensure a strong future for the country. He notes that more and more people are starting to agree with these ideas, and politicians are beginning to recognize the need for a new approach to trade. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.